Hi everyone, chapter 4 overview here. This is a brief chapter, well, fairly brief chapter, so this lecture won't be too long, but just following up on some of the main ideas in the text. Excuse me, still getting over a little bit of a cold here. Want to start here and focus on the four major periods that are outlined in the chapter. And they are the mercantile colonial period, the industrialization period, the monopoly capitalism period, and the global capitalism period. And the mercantile colonial period, as the text outlines, was the period from about 1630 to about 1812. And this was a period of time in which the majority of what was happening in what we now call the United States was the British colony, the British monarch had sent colonies, different groups of people out to different areas of the United States with the directive that they were to, well, for lack of a better word, to take over or identify any resources that were on this continent that either the British Crown didn't have at the time, or that they didn't have as much as they wanted or needed. And so resources such as coal or things such as, iron, etc. Those were things that were identified by the colonists as something that could be um, resourced for the British Crown. Of course, as we all know, during this time period as well, the colonists became quite good, and I don't mean it in a positive way, but they became quite good at displacing native peoples in the areas where they went. They became quite good at um, using the land in ways that the native peoples never would have used the land because they respected it too much. And so this mercantile colonial period was really characterized by colonists being sent over by the British Crown. They are identifying resources and making certain that these resources get back to the British Crown in some way. The next period, the industrial, oh, and by the way, then of course what happens is that we see that these port towns, most of these early settlements are near ports, near water, or if there's not already a port where one can be built. So it's easy to load materials onto ships. Those ships sail over to Britain, and then those ships come back, pick up another load, etc. So the primary early colonial cities that you could think about are places such as Boston, of course, New York, Virginia, etc. Places where it was very easy to access the ocean because you want to ship those things over um, to the British Crown. The industrialization period here, we're focused on, excuse me, we're focused on the period from 1812 to 1920, thereabouts. And during this period is when we see industrialization begin and really take off, such that by the early 1920s, we see that manufacturing has become much more mechanized, which means, of course, then several things. Number one, agriculture has become more mechanized. There are easier ways, for example, to pick cotton, because it was during this time period that the cotton gin um, was invented. But also, of course, railways were built, which meant that it was easier to move goods from the interior parts or further away from the ports, ship the goods over to the ports on trains, and then load them onto the ships. It's also, of course, a period during which, because agriculture becomes so much more efficient, food can be grown with fewer people, and more of it can be grown with fewer people. And so not as many people are needed in the rural or agricultural areas, and so they then start to move into the cities. because they know there are jobs there. They can work in factories and textile mills, they can go work in coal mines, etc. And so we really are seeing this industrialization period become one in which fewer and fewer people are working in agriculture and more people are working in cities and in coal mines and in industry, etc. The monopoly capitalism period. This is the period during which 1920 to about 1960. This is the period where cities really begin to become what we know them to be today. Cities where there's a city center and there is commerce going on, there's industry going on, people are living in the city center. Many of the people who during this time live in the city center are people who are professionals. They want to be close to the banking industry or the finance industry or the legal industry, etc. They tend to be well educated, they make decent incomes, and so of course we see then that art museums are created. We also see that philharmonics or symphonies for a large city are created, the ballet, the opera, etc. All of these cultural aspects that we think of a major city having today are created during this time period because, of course, people who make a decent income are going to want to have these leisure activities to engage in, right? Opera, theater, ballet, symphonies, etc. Of course, that does not mean that poor people or working class people leave the city um, immediately, but we do see that um, a great number of people who were living in the city start to move a little further out because it becomes quite expensive to live in the city. And of course, we'll see that reversed in that last period, the global capitalism period. But continuing on with this metropolitan period, um, during this period, of course, there's also planning of these cities in a much more careful way. Urban planning is a discipline now. It's something that as cities are growing, there's a lot of thought put into how do we continue to develop the city so that it makes sense. In the first two, the colonial and the industrial periods, there wasn't as much thought given to how to develop a city properly, how to think about infrastructure and roads and sanitation and all of those things. Particularly during the colonial period, uh, people just built a home where they found some land that wasn't claimed yet. And there wasn't a lot of thought given to roads and paving them and all of those kinds of things. In the industrializing, some of that begins to happen toward the latter part of this period, like in the latter part of the 1800s. But even then, if you look at any historical accounts or watch any historical movies or documentaries, you see that, for example, um, quite a bit of the city of New York, which is a huge metropolitan, excuse me, I'm so sorry, I'll drink some water here, take these out really quickly. Okay, sorry about that. But again, thinking about New York City, which probably many of us have seen movies where the city is presented. If you look at those documentaries or period movies or series where New York City is portrayed, you see that a lot of the streets are not yet paved. They are still dirt and perhaps gravel and maybe some cobblestone in some of the very early cities, but they're not anything like the planning and the thoughtfulness that's gone into the metropolitan period. The global capitalism period from 1960 to today. Here is where we really start to see that um, change in the way the population is distributed. So as I said, in the metropolitan period, we see a lot of educated professionals who live in the city. They want to be close to their industry, wherever their office is. But in the 1960s, we start to see that change as people move into areas of cities that before had not been available to them. Maybe they couldn't afford it, or perhaps in some states there were racial covenants, which meant that if you were a person of color, um, people agreed not to sell houses to you. That's a nice way of, I don't mean that in a good way either. That's a way of keeping your community as white as possible. But by 1960, of course, all of those things have fallen away. People of color, particularly during that Great Migration, from about 1920 to 1960, more people of color have been moving into the cities, primarily during that Great Migration. Of course, it's blacks who have begun moving out of agricultural areas and into northern and western cities. And so what we start to see in the 1960s, particularly by the mid to late 1960s, is we start to see what sociologists call white flight, whereby those educated middle and upper middle class people begin to move out of the city and into suburbs. Yes, they have to commute, but excuse me, cities either build the subways that go further out, or in the case of LA, the freeways are just extended and extended and extended, and they're widened as more and more people commute. And of course, what we see in cities today then is this very multi-centered expansion, where we see that in many urban areas there is an attempt to revitalize areas that perhaps had become um, more rundown than other areas. Some people call this urban renewal, others call it gentrification. I'll let you think about that, and it'll be covered in more detail in another chapter where I'll give you an assignment to do that. But we see that, again, take example, LA. Many of you are familiar with LA. So you think about the city center, downtown LA, and you think about, okay, the courthouses are there, the district attorney's office is there, the excuse me, the mayor's offices, etc. And there is banking and finance and some tech stuff going on in downtown LA. But you also see those layers or those rings around where there is housing. And there is housing in downtown LA too, but again, it tends to be more expensive. So the people who live there tend to be those professionals. But then we see that a lot of people live in the suburbs around LA. And many of the people who once lived near downtown LA, because it was close to their jobs, people who work in the service industries, janitors, and people who work cleaning office buildings, and who work fast food and all those things. A lot of LA, because of that urban renewal, the areas where those people live near downtown LA, for example, where LA Live and Staples Center are, those used to be lower income apartment complexes. And of course, the city made the decision to get rid of those and to build something that was going to bring in a lot of tax dollars, a lot of revenue, tourists, etc. We can also think about this. Let me just quickly jump back to the metropolitan period. In the late 1940s into the early 1950s, there was an attempt that was successful, in my view, unfortunately, but if you're a Dodger fan, you might agree with it. There was an attempt to bring a major baseball team to LA. And Walter O'Malley, who was the owner of the Dodgers at the time, struck a deal with the city of LA, the leaders at the time, to bring the team here if they could identify a place where a stadium could be built. And the city identified a place where today you wouldn't know it's there. It's the community was known as Chavez Ravine. Chavez Ravine was where Mexican and Mexican-American families lived. They had built their own little houses. They were not necessarily anything special. In fact, some of them might have even been kind of, you know, um, for lack of a better word, kind of thrown together with whatever people could find. But they were where people lived. People grew their own food. They had chickens and other animals. They were self-sufficient, and they had jobs, most of them as well. And they worked near downtown LA or in downtown LA. But unfortunately, because the city decided that was the perfect place to build what became Dodger Stadium, um, all those people were over several years, because some people did take the money. They thought, well, okay, they're going to give me some money for this house. I'll go ahead and take it and I'll move and leave somewhere else. But there were quite a few families who did not want to leave and who resisted. And there are documentaries about Chavez Ravine that you can take a look at if you'd like. But that is one example of this metropolitan period and how cities were really focused on, well, we've got to provide the recreational leisure activities for the people who live here, um, without really thinking about the people who couldn't afford to go to those functions. Okay, so, excuse me. I'm going to go here now um, to something that is discussed in the text, in terms of the spatial and the functional and the demographic differentiation of the city. A lot of those other slides that I passed by the way, are information that is in the text, and also some of it I went over as well in my own lecture there. So, focusing on how cities are created, how they are developed, we really have to consider, at least by the end of the 1800s, the technological advances, the middle to the late 1800s, the technological advances, things such as the railroads and mechanization, etc., and then moving into the early part of the 20th century, where the car is created and developed. And Henry Ford is the first car maker to make a car that can be afforded by quite a few people. It's not only made for wealthy people. So all of that technological advance going on, and of course all the way through the 60s, where the U.S. put men on the moon. Also, the internet was being developed by the military, and what a boon for all of us. We began to be able to start using it by the late 1980s. The political as well, what was happening during all of these different periods of time. Probably most of you know that by the mid to late 1960s, there were quite a few social movements going on for people of color were engaged in social movements, but there was also quite a bit of social movements in terms of women and women's rights, as well as excuse me, as well as the Vietnam War. And so all of those things are going on and become quite active. It seems that prior to the mid 1960s, there wasn't a whole lot of political activity that people took on. There was some, and you might know that in the 1950s there was the Red Scare. Senator Joseph McCarthy was on this mission to weed out all the supposed communists, etc. So I don't mean to say there wasn't any, but the mid to the late 1960s really saw a flurry of activity. And I think that we've continued to see that today. Not so much in the 70s. There was the gay rights movement in the early 1970s, and continuing on through the 90s. But I think we're back to that place, much like the mid to late 1960s, where we see a lot of political activity from various groups, grassroots movements, as well as groups that have been around for a long time, like the ACLU, the Sierra Club, etc. And of course, the cultural factors, particularly in the global capitalism era, which is 1960 to now. We really see this huge growth of culture between and among various countries and peoples being shared across all types of social media. Things such as TikTok and WhatsApp and Instagram. I'm sure there's a bunch more that I don't even know about, Twitch, etc. All of the cultural sharing, as I said, between and among countries is something that when I was, a teenager in the 1970s, I never even could have begun to believe might happen. It just didn't seem like something that would happen. Um, and then, of course, thinking about the socio-spatial uh, aspect to how cities develop. So remember, it's that idea of the economics, the politics, and the culture. They're all interdependent. They all feed off of each other. So, for example, if you think about the social media platforms that I mentioned, those are intertwined with economics because someone creates those social platforms. They then form a company, and eventually, some of these companies become quite profitable. Recently, the stock market's not been so great, but Facebook and Twitter, remember Elon Musk announcing he wanted to buy Twitter. I think he's trying to get out of the deal right now. But you think about how intertwined the cultural aspect, the social media platforms, and economics are. And then, of course, that's intertwined with politics because you consider how there is a push by some to try to make social media platforms more responsible or accountable for what people say on their on these various social media platforms. And some people think that's a good idea, some people don't, but also consider the whole privacy issue with all of these social media platforms that people use, and not just the social media platforms. If you use Google, and you can see mine is open down here. Yes, I use Google. I do have settings that try to protect my privacy, but I know that I'm giving up some of my privacy every single time I use the Google browser. And so that's just one example of how intertwined um, that one aspect of culture or aspect of society, social media, is intertwined in those three ways. So that's, I think, where I wanted to finish. Let me just see here. Yeah, I think that's where I wanted to finish. Okay, and plus I think I'm starting to lose my voice here. So I'll see you for chapter 5.